Hi, and welcome to InstaVision with Glenn Reynolds. And today my guest is John Birmingham, the best-selling science fiction author from Australia. He's the author of the Axis of Time novels, in which 21st century American soldiers meet World War II American soldiers with, well, I would say hilarity ensues, although sometimes it does. He's also the author of Without Warning, where America just disappears, and a lot of people in the world who thought that was going to be great discover that maybe it's not so great. And also a nonfiction book drawing on his own expertise, a book with Dirk Flinthart called How to Be a Man, full of all kinds of useful advice. And it really is full of useful advice. Welcome, John. It's so great to have you here.
Oh, it's good to be here, Glenn, via the wonders of technology, mate.
That's right, the miracle of the internet. Trans-hemispheric, actually two ways, I guess, north, south, east, west. It's really cool. Well,
Yeah,
welcome, and it's just great to have you here. It really is. Well, you wrote the Axis of Time books, for which you've become quite famous, of course. And what gave you the idea to take Americans from actually a decade or two from now and put them back in the World War II era? There was sort of a movie vaguely along the same theory, but what gave you the idea?
Trying to escape, actually. When I started working on that book, which is a fair while ago now, it was pre-9/11, I was trapped in State Library in New South Wales, the state that Sydney is the capital of, working on a vast historical tome. It was a big, fat, hardback history of Sydney, which I wanted to put out before the Olympic Games. And it was very much like writing not just a PhD thesis, but 3 or 4 PhD theses, one after another. And I just needed something to wind down with at the end of the day, because I was in the library from the moment it opened until the moment it closed late at night. And so for the last hour or so, for a while I was playing video games, but they expanded to take over my whole day, so I threw them off my hard drive. And eventually I picked up a book by Steve Sterling, actually, Island in the Sea of Time, and read that. I thought, oh, that's really cool, that's a great book. And then I read a techno thriller by an Australian writer called Matthew Riley. And just in the way that these things happen, the idea of the techno thriller and the alternate history with a bit of time travel involved all fused in one happy moment. And I just said, oh, wouldn't it be great to do a story where, a military force went back in time and they, oh no, what about a military force from the future? And it went on and on. The thing is, Glenn, I never actually intended to write that book. I made notes and actually wrote a few sample chapters just as a thought experiment, and really as a form of relaxation at the end of the day. And as soon as my big hardback was finished and the manuscript was sent away, I put those notes into a drawer and never thought of them again until maybe 12, 18 months down the track. I was talking to a friend of mine, Garth Nix, the fantasy author, who used to work as an agent in Australia. And we were just talking about the dumbest films we'd ever seen, the dumbest books we'd ever read. And I said to Garth, just joking offhand, oh mate, I once had an idea for the dumbest book ever written, and gave him the broad outline of what became Weapons of Choice. Anyway, Garth, who's much more business-minded than me, his eyes went as big as dinner plates, and he went, oh, that's not a dumb idea, that's a fantastic idea, you must let me see it. And I said, look, I'll show you the notes I made on the proviso that you don't tell anybody about it, and you just keep it to yourself, because I had just spent 4.5 years in that library becoming a very serious, pointy-headed non-fiction author. My background was as a comedy writer previously. And, I don't want to blow those 4.5 years if anyone finds out that I've just written the dumbest book ever thought of. Anyway, Garth, of course, took my notes and completely disobeyed me. And the next thing I knew, I had Russ Galen on the phone from New York demanding the manuscript yesterday. So I became a genre writer by accident.
It's funny how often that happens. I mean, that's, of course, how it happened with Robert Heinlein, who entered a writing contest and the next thing he knew, he was off on a lifelong career. So I guess that's just the way it goes. What interested me about those novels in particular is you've got Americans from the year 2021, and they're dealing with Americans from the year 1942. So there's quite a long time gap, and they're all Americans, but they're really different. And I felt like you really honed in well on sort of America now and as it's likely to be in 10 years versus America as it was back then. And do you think being an Australian gives you an advantage, an outsider's perspective on that, or is it just that you're a fabulous writer?
A bit of both, I imagine, mate. There is an advantage in sitting outside a culture when you write about it, if that culture, as yours is, happens to be global. When Tiger Woods was recently in Australia, he apparently sat in his hotel room and watched NFL all night. You can do that here. You can come to Australia and still immerse yourself in American culture. And I've always liked American magazines and books, movies and TV shows, and so I have a reasonable understanding of it. But I do sit outside US culture, and so I think it definitely helped. Although if you read the many reader reviews on Amazon of Weapons of Choice Now, one of the things which really upset a lot of people about that book was the portrayal of the 1940s characters as being a lot more bigoted and a lot more sexist than the oh so PC people from the future. But that's really the engine of the book. People get overwhelmed by the idea of these fusion-powered aircraft carriers and submarines turning up from the future. And, they could kick Hitler's butt in an afternoon. Well, yes, they could, but the interesting question for me was whether or not the 1940s, Anglo-Saxon monoculture would want to be rescued from Hitler by basically people from our equal opportunity future. African Americans and lesbian Latino jet fighter pilots, and so that for me was the great fun of that novel. And for those people who liked it, I suspect that was the fun too. But there were a lot of people who got really upset by that, and by the fact that I named the aircraft carrier the Hillary Clinton. That was a great surprise to me. For all I can claim to know a bit about American culture, I didn't know how upset some people would get by naming the aircraft carrier after Hillary.
That was one of my favorite touches, naming it after the America's most uncompromising wartime president, I think is how you put it. I always thought that was terrific. Well, your most recent book now I'm sorry.
I think I got away with that because my background in Australia is as a comedy writer and a satirist, but of course in the US, weapons came out cold. I have no history there, or had none at that point. So I think people took, the USS Hillary Clinton a bit more seriously than it was intended.
I loved it. I took it in exactly the spirit in which it was intended. Now, your most recent novel is Without Warning, and it's very different. Lots of people in the world, of course, don't like America that much, and in your novel, they get what they wanted. It's 2003. The United States is just about to invade Iraq, and all of a sudden, poof, practically the whole country vanishes with just a little bit left. Guantanamo Bay stays, and sort of Washington State and Alaska and Hawaii, but pretty much all the continental United States otherwise, and a good chunk of Canada and part of Mexico disappears fairly mysteriously. You don't really give a lot of background into how that happens. But the rest of the world is left to deal with what happens next, and the celebrations don't last that long. What made you think of that?
That was actually a conversation I had with I wouldn't call him a friend. He was a guy that I knew many, many years ago on campus. He was a genuine left-wing radical, a paid-up member of the Socialist Party of Australia, and a postgraduate English student at that time, of course. And I was at some campus demonstration. I was quite the radical when my hair was longer. And we turned up to, I think the Chinese army had just gone into Tiananmen Square and killed everybody, and there was a little demonstration on campus because we had a lot of Chinese students in Queensland at the university at that point, and they were very upset, as you'd imagine. And I turned up to the demo because, you know, I had long hair. That's what you do. And this guy Adrian was there. He had even longer hair than me. It was beautiful and golden and curly. I think he kept his, which is why he's still a socialist. And we sort of vaguely knew each other, and we got to arguing about Tiananmen. It was an argument because he was one of these lunatics who blamed everything, absolutely everything, on America, which was particularly easy for him at that point because Bush Sr. was the president. And he somehow tried to blame the Chinese army going into Tiananmen Square and massacring the students on George Bush Sr.'s foreign policy. And it just made my head go boing. And I got into quite a full-on argument with him, to the point where he became so enraged. He ended up screaming at me that we'd all be a lot better off if we just woke up one morning and they were all just gone, you know, spittle flying from his mouth. And at the time I thought, oh, you know, you're such a moron. But what a great idea for a book. The funny thing was, I wasn't writing books at that point. It took me another 10 years, I think, before I wrote my first novel, and it wasn't a genre of novel. But after I finished Axis of Time, I was talking with Russ, Russ Galen, who became my agent, and saying, oh, what are we going to do next, Russ? And I had ideas for all sorts of things I wanted to do, like an alternate 1980s book. But then, for some reason, I suppose thinking about the 1980s, the vision of that lunatic blaming Tiananmen on George Bush popped into my head, and that phrase he'd said, we'd all be a lot better if we woke up one day and America was just gone. It was just there, a big glowing line in front of me, and I thought, yes, I'll do that book.
Well, it's interesting. In a way, we're sort of living a much diluted version of that thesis. And in fact, you know, Ann Applebaum had a piece in Slate just the other day saying that, you know, Obama and America sort of don't seem to want to be the global superpower anymore. And while nobody really wanted America to be the global superpower, nobody else really wants to step up and take responsibility for doing the kinds of things a global superpower does either. So it's a very watered down version of America just disappearing, of course. But you think we're feeling a little bit of that now?
Yeah, it was. I was very much aware of that change when I sat down to do Without Warning, and actually I'm working on the sequel right now. You know, my publishers are watching this. Here it is. Here's the thing I'm editing right now. When I sat down to do the sequel, it was post the financial crash, and also obviously much towards the end of the Iraq entanglement, and the idea of withdrawal and possibly the end of American superpower was very much in the air, and it was something that I wanted to play through in the book, because you do see it work itself out in mainstream media comment quite frequently, the idea that a lot of the world's troubles, particularly in the Middle East, are driven by American policy, which there are elements of it which, yeah, I mean, you know, we will argue about the Iraq commitment for decades to come. But, you know, on balance, I don't know how anybody could say that American power is bad for the world. It's, you know, it's such a good, and what I just wanted to get across in that book is, well, just imagine the world without it. Let's just take American power, pop, it's gone. What happens next? And so, in a way, we are living that now. It hasn't been a wrenching withdrawal of what in the book I thought of as the beating heart of the world economy. But I was in the US about 8 months ago for the Without Warning book tour, and the economy there was frightening. It was much worse than it was in Australia, and you could see that something terrible was happening, and hand in hand with that, of course, you've had a change in administration, and Yeah, well, it feels like a withdrawal from the world. Not necessarily a happy one, not one that they wanted to, but the constraints on American power seem much greater. Although I read that piece by Applebaum, and she had a great quote from one of the Chinese mandarins about how China didn't want to become the world's policeman, and it was interesting because they seem to have taken to heart George Washington's comment about foreign entanglements. But if you look at what China and India are doing in the Indian Ocean, they're setting up for a great power rivalry in that sphere that will last for at least the next 100 years or so.
Well, that's a cheerful note. One final point I'll make to you, your book, How to Be a Man, I actually gave a copy of that to my nephew when he was 15, and he is now 19, and he's a licensed helicopter pilot and a certified scuba diver, and, well, he's 6'5" and weighs 220, too, so I guess it works. I recommend that book to everybody. Maybe the passage of time.
Ultimately, perhaps he didn't need the advice. Perhaps, it was just good DNA, that rugged Reynolds DNA.
There you go. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us from all the way there, and I look forward to After America coming back, and people who are watching and want to check you out can visit you at cheeseburgergothic.com. And thanks again for taking the time to talk with us.
Thanks, mate.
And thanks to everybody for joining me here. This is InstaVision for this week, and until next time, have fun on the internet.